Welcome to the first of a three-part series I'm calling Sony's Year of Embarrassment, a series where I am going to chronicle the insane choice Sony has made to release 3 guaranteed bombs in the Sony Spider-Man universe, or the SSU, in the year of our Lord 2024. It genuinely cannot be stated enough just how truly mad a studio has to be to think that this strategy is going to work, and it's honestly made me rethink how I judge other studios, because for all the criticisms you can rightfully give studios like WB and Disney, this right here dwarfs anything they could ever do. Not even in their wildest dreams would any of these companies do something this insane.
He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders right before she died.
The bar has been completely reset, people, to the point where shit-talking Star Wars or the MCU or the now dead DCEU, fun as it is, don't get me wrong, just no longer carries the same weight, because just look at this shit. What are you gonna say about Marvel now? I mean, at least they can get like one success a year, okay? That's something. But these Sony abominations, they're just something else. Even the usual smooth-brained film critics who give every movie a positive review are trashing Madam Web, and for good reason too. I mean, it's terrible, but even still, a few of the reviews I've seen are just brutal. I really haven't seen reviews this universally merciless in I don't know how long. I think it broke Mike Flanagan's brain also. Someone should go check on him. And even though I'm going to add to that dog pile, again, for good reason, it makes you almost feel bad for this movie. Almost. I mean, it is a Sony product here, so that kind of overrides any of those feelings, but damn, man. Let me just say I'm glad I'm not involved in the making of this movie.
Oh, what the hell? She didn't see that coming? That's not how it works.
Anyway though, in this series, I want to go through the specific films coming out this year, being Madam Web, Kraven the Hunter, and Venom 3, and not just talk about why they're bad. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, and yes, I'm going out on a very bold limb here, assuming the other two are also going to suck. Just gonna pencil that one in there. Feel free to bet against it.
They say he uses a connection with animals to track his prey.
So yeah, Madam Web sucks, and so will the other two, and I'll get into why, because it's hilarious and makes for great content, but I also want to talk about the conditions around these films that lead to them being so terrible, because that's arguably the only real interesting nugget of this whole debacle, because it's not really that strange for movies like these to suck. I mean, since the turn of the 21st century, we've all been subjected to countless terrible comic book films, both standalone and part of like cinematic universes. But these recent Sony ones really seem to represent the death of any art that ever existed in the genre. They're so nakedly cynical and have such contempt for their audience and have no evidence of any effort being put into any of them, to the point where I really do feel bad for people who spend their money on them. Not ironic morons like me or you, yes, you count too, who buy a ticket knowing it'll suck. Okay, we know what we're getting ourselves into, that's on us. But the average casual filmgoer doesn't always know this stuff and doesn't like actively pay attention to the internet pop culture discourse, and they shouldn't have to either. Like, you should be able to blindly wander into a random movie theater, whether the film you're watching is good or not, and at least feel like the studio isn't just holding a giant middle finger up to you the whole time and laughing at you for spending your time and money on this, which is what is happening with these products that you, by the loosest possible definition, can describe as movies. Like, I saw Madam Web opening day at the very first showing in my town because, again, I'm a moron, and unexpectedly the theater was damn near empty save for maybe like 10 people, and one of the groups there was a family of 4, a young couple with 2 kids no older than like 6 or 7, a couple that likely was not there ironically like I was and just wanted to enjoy a fun day at the movies. They dragged out their 2 kids who were not sitting still the whole movie and required numerous bathroom breaks and snacks and every possible appeasement just to keep them sitting still so the adults could watch the movie they overpaid for. And this is what they were subjected to. I couldn't help but feel bad for them because they were duped, hoodwinked, swindled, taken for a ride, double-crossed, shafted, misled, other ways of saying that. It's just a thing that shouldn't have happened, and even if they were there for the same dumb, ironic reason I was, someone somewhere has been tricked by this movie. Someone bought a ticket thinking that the people who made this movie tried. And that idea has been something that's been somewhat of a revelation to me since I made my last video on this topic, because one of the things I just couldn't wrap my brain around was how Sony expected people to give a shit about any of these movies. Because much as the superhero genre has owned the last 15-ish years, the overall popularity of them has been waning in the recent couple years, and if the top dogs like Marvel and DC are struggling, how are you going to get people to care about these Z-list nothing characters like Morbius and Madam Web? And as it turns out, the strategy was and continues to be to trick people.
Intriguing.
The one and really only consistent effort across all of these projects has been trying to tie themselves to the MCU as much as humanly possible without just outright giving all these characters to Disney. It's evident in Morbius with the pointless inclusion of the MCU Vulture. It's evident in Venom with Eddie being transported to the MCU during the events of No Way Home. And it's most cynically evident in this one by changing the time this movie takes place in post from the 90s to the 2000s by showing like a Beyonce billboard and a Blockbuster and also some terrible ADR lines like, "I gotta go home and watch Idol." There's even like a Martha Stewart joke, which I don't think a single person under the age of 35 is going to understand, and it's all done for the sole purpose of better matching up with the birth of, I guess, the MCU Tom Holland Peter Parker, I guess? All these things that are almost certainly never going to be addressed or brought up ever again were done with the express intention of tricking the audience into thinking these are all part of the same universe as the MCU, or at the very least will lead to a future MCU includement, both of which are flatly not true and never going to happen.
Intriguing.
The only possible defense for this is if the Sony suits really are that stupid and delusional to think that any of this is ever going to happen. But even then, it's still completely disingenuous because they don't know, and they don't care either. They just want you to think that all this completely meaningless nonsense is actually going somewhere, even though it's most certainly not. It's all a facade, stupid or intentional.
Intriguing.
The talent they bring on also seems to not realize what universe they are getting themselves into, as evident by Dakota Johnson and Sydney Sweeney tagging Marvel Studios in their posts regarding their casting when it was initially announced last year. Now, to be fair, we can only speculate on this as we don't know like 100% if they truly didn't know that it wasn't in the MCU or how much they did know, but it is fair to say that they likely did not have the full range of knowledge that they most certainly do now. Now, what they would have done if they had that knowledge is unknown, but I do imagine it would at least make them and others like poor old Matt Smith think twice before accepting these roles. Just gonna take a big swing on that theory. And not to get too off track, but to be a bit more, I guess, critical of these actors, I will say that while it of course sucks being duped into movies as embarrassing as these, and I do sympathize, I feel like if you are a professional actor, you should probably do some research into the roles that you are considering accepting. Sure, Sony might not tell you all the details, but it's not hard for you to find out for yourself, especially if it's your entire career. And I get that shit like this is why they have agents, which explains why Dakota Johnson fired her agent after that initial trailer dropped, but you can still do like a minute of Googling to find this stuff out. I mean, I'm no actor, so what do I know? But I feel like if I was, I would spend a few minutes looking into like some stuff before I just take roles willy-nilly. I mean, maybe these people are on like some list of fools that you can pull one over on in Hollywood, and other actors who are capable of using the internet passed on these before these dummies finally got offered. Who knows really?
So, while my character in the movie may be able to see the future, I also can. And I know what the future brings. I know that when you see Madam Web, you're gonna love it. In fact, I think you're gonna see it twice.
Anyway though, back on track, regardless of how much you do or do not sympathize with the audience and the actors being tricked here, it's a thing. Now, it's hilarious of course, which is why these last two installments have become like mini cultural phenomenons, but it is mostly just sad. Like even bad or controversial movies have actual fans. Like I know people in real life who passionately defend and love Batman v Superman despite what anyone else will say. Almost all movies have people who genuinely like them, but no one is an unironic fan of Madam Web or Morbius or any of this shit. Now, I will say, Venom, mostly to the credit of Tom Hardy, does have actual fans, which is a thing I'll probably address when that movie comes out, but if your entire audience is made up of either idiots like me who seek out and enjoy this kind of garbage, or people who are tricked into thinking these are real movies, that is the true death of the art form. And yes, I know you hear that thrown around a lot these days, and it's mostly bullshit. I mean, people have been claiming cinema is dead ever since the fucking spoken word was added to movies, but the real death of the art form is when people no longer go to the movies to actually enjoy them. If the only amount of excitement you can muster up for your film is irony, it has no value. Now you can have both. The fan base of the Fast and Furious films is made up of people who enjoy them ironically and people who actually think it's cool and badass. That's fine, but irony alone just leaves your film completely devoid of any artistic value. And these Sony films are even worse, arguably, because that isn't even their intention. They've achieved this entirely through sheer laziness and cynicism, just a complete lack of effort. I mean, at least those terrible Sharknado films are like intentionally bad, or films like The Room were made with a real effort, but these Sony movies are just complete flatlines. Everyone involved at every level is so indifferent to the quality of all these movies. So why should they expect anyone to care unless they really do just think we are all that stupid? Which honestly seems to be the case. Like, you as a studio do not put out a film like Madam Web or Morbius twice unless you think the people you are catering to are the dumbest, lowest common denominator scum that isn't worthy of even a shred of respect. Because they know these movies are terrible. They have to. There is no possible way they don't. So the only logical reason they feel comfortable putting them out is because they think their audience is completely undeserving of respect, brain dead, and does not possess even a 10-year-old's level of media literacy. Like, I can be a very cynical person, but even I don't think this low of humanity. Most of us can tell what a bad movie is, especially if it's this bad, and even in an industry as cynical and soulless as Hollywood, these goddamn monstrosities have somehow reset the bar to a point where, again, I just can't look at other terrible movies the same way again. I mean, even The Conqueror had more inspiration than this, and that movie literally gave people cancer. That's true, by the way, look it up.
You return empty-handed from the chase, my son?
Not so, fine gazelle.
Now we seek bigger game, Hunlin.
How many merkets did you observe?
30? No more.
We'll take twice that number. Call Bagurci and Sabaya.
And that kind of leads me into another incredible thing about these Sony movies and Madam Web specifically. You see, in almost all famous bad movies, regardless of what era they're from, whether it's the 50s or the 80s, the 2000s, or from the past few years, one of the consistent reasons movies like those become infamous is not just because of the quality of the finished product, or I guess the lack thereof, but also the production and the behind-the-scenes issues that lead to the film being so terrible. It's an almost universal issue movies in this category have, but when you look at the production of something like Madam Web, the most shocking thing is that there really isn't anything shocking at all.
Intriguing.
There were some rewrites over the years while it was still being conceptualized, and a bit of reshoots that happened, but nothing too out of the ordinary for a movie like this. They seem to have an idea of what they wanted, and a fairly smooth casting process, and from all accounts, a pretty normal production. There's nothing disastrous you can point to and say, oop, that's where it all went wrong. It's this bad fully on its own merit, which is perhaps the greatest indictment you can bring against it. All the usual bugaboos movies like this face just don't apply here. When you boil it down, it appears to be just a case of Sony assembling, quite possibly, the Avengers of terrible filmmaking. Right from the top, you have the infamously terrible producer, Lorenzo di Bonaventura, I think, who has a list of embarrassing productions that can compete with anyone's. The writers, who are likely fake human aliases for AI, have a track record of scripts so bad, it doesn't even seem real. I mean, this is the stuff of legends here. Not since the late aughts, early 2010s run of Orsi and Kurtzman have I seen a duo this cursed. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, how do you write Gods of Egypt and continue to get work? How do you write Morbius and continue to get work? I mean, good for them for keeping their lights on, but what they have over Hollywood that allows them to keep writing scripts this bad, I have no idea. Their filmography is literally a visual representation of the concept of failing upwards.
I, Set, shall be your one true king. King of all Egypt!
And finally, in the director's chair, you have a for-hire TV director that, while I'm sure it can make the rounds on shows well enough, brings no vision and absolutely no cinematic quality to the movie. Every shot is completely stale and flat, though sometimes the movie will switch to like this handheld style, which is something, I guess, but even that's executed in a way that makes those scenes come off like shots from The Office. Like they even do the comedic zoom thing from that show. I know that sounds like bullshit, but I promise you I'm not lying. It's literally one character jimming the camera away from being a direct scene-to-scene knockoff of that show.
Please don't jim the camera like that.
The action is borderline non-existent. There's essentially no set pieces. Like, I would love to see these storyboards for this movie, if they even exist, because it seems like every sequence was conceptualized with the idea of how can we get the most basic information across to the audience in the simplest, easiest to shoot, cheapest scene possible. Everything is shot in a car or in a room or nope, that's basically it. It's some real Oscar-worthy effort all around. They don't even bother writing the typical cringy Joss Whedon quippy jokes. In fact, there's barely any jokes at all, hardly any licensed music either, which normally would be a good thing since so many of these movies just shove in as many pop songs as humanly possible in them. But in their place, there's barely any music at all beyond what sounds like stock music.
Intriguing.
But honestly, what else do you expect when this is the team you assemble? I mean, you get what you're paying for. It's just a simple matter of talent. Talent that Sony is apparently unwilling to pay for. It's the same bare bones, cheap effort that is usually reserved for movies like this year's Night Swim, except the key difference there is that movies like Night Swim have less than zero expectations and a very small budget to make back, while Madam Web is not only a movie that is supposed to make significant money, but also help build an entire cinematic universe that can supposedly compete with Marvel and DC. And to think that you can achieve that level of ambition and success with the cheapest, laziest crop of talent is nothing short of madness. But it results in something that's kind of magical in the sense that it's a combination you don't often see. It's all the terrible tropes and downfalls of the late era superhero craze mixed with the budget, effort, and talent pool of a cheap January horror movie. It's Morbius come again, except unlike Morbius, this one crosses over into the realm of so bad it's good, and I kind of love it for that.
Shouldn't see that coming.
I know I just spent like 15 minutes trashing the people and circumstances that allowed this horror to exist, and I stand by all of that because as someone who loves movies, it is genuinely upsetting and disgusting that this got made. It's a bummer, no getting around that, but it's also a very worthy inclusion into the terrible movie Hall of Fame, which Morbius was not, okay? The only enjoyable thing about Morbius was the memes around it and how it led to Sony putting it back in theaters. That was awesome, but the movie itself is just boring, not even like funny bad. But Madam Web though, this one's special. The initial trailer was special, even if that amazing line didn't make it into the final cut of the movie. The embarrassing marketing campaign where the lead of the film basically openly talked about how terrible the movie was going to be was special, and everything that happened in the movie was special. It's an unintentionally genius, borderline Naked Gun-esque takedown of the superhero genre that was born from nothing but its complete indifference to its own existence.
Intriguing.
I mean, I was frantically taking notes during this because there were just so many baffling moments and things that you have to see to believe. Like, there's actually things to talk about with this movie, which again, really was not the case with Sony's last slot bucket. Not great things, mind you, but it's still more than whatever Morbius had to offer. I mean, the best scene from that movie is literally a scene that doesn't even exist. This one though, man, I could just spend the next like 10 or so minutes simply listing off insane shit that happens in it, which is pretty much exactly what I'm going to do because there is just no other way to describe the madness contained in Madam Web. It's amazing. The script feels like not even a first draft of a movie, but like a collection of loose notes they strung together. Every single line exists only in a purely functional manner where no one says anything beyond what they need to move the plot along. I would describe it as efficient if I was being generous, but that would still be a stretch because most of it fails to actually explain the movie in a way that makes sense. I still couldn't really tell you what the movie was about or what the bad guys' motivation was or what was going on with the spider people tribe in the Amazon. Don't even get me started on whatever the heck that was. It's both needlessly complicated and simple to the point where almost nothing happens, aside from, I guess, when Madam Web packs up and goes to Peru in the third act, only to come back in like 10 minutes, where the movie essentially resumes exactly where it was before she left. I mean, even down to the conceptual level of this, you can find hilarious, insane choices being made. Case in point, the main gimmick of the movie, which is Madam Web's power of clairvoyance. Not a crazy thing to put in a movie, and certainly not a thing that hasn't been done before 1,000 times, but in this particular film, the way it's implemented basically results in you having to rewatch the same terrible scenes over and over again because she's not getting a peek into the future and reacting. She's going through entire scenes of flat, expository, cringe-inducing dialogue and then gets snapped back to reality, and you have to watch the whole thing over again, except this time she has this like permanently confused face on. This happens so much throughout the film, so just keep that in mind when I mention literally anything else because it's likely that much of it must be watched back to back.
In fact, I think you're going to see it twice.
And it's also the only real display of superpowers in the movie. I mean, even by the standards of a generic superhero origin story movie, the amount of actual powers and abilities being used is almost zero. There's some very basic stuff with the spider people tribe in the Amazon and also the main bad guy who can crawl on walls, but that's basically it. I don't even know if those guys have super strength because our heroes easily evade the bad guy and fight him with almost no issues. We do see one of the spider people run through the jungle like the vampires in Twilight, so I guess that's some indication, but again, there's really no telling how strong anyone is because the action scenes, superpowered or not, are essentially non-existent. Like, I'm not so married to the orgy of superpowers in these kinds of films that I'll throw a fit if it's more subtle and realistic, but you gotta have like basic action sequences in an action movie. It's like having a war movie where no one shoots guns despite everyone having guns. Literally, and this is no exaggeration, the only action sequences in Madam Web are people running or Madam Web driving her car into the bad guy and then driving away. Madam Web's ability to run people over with cars is the only exciting action adjacent thing that happens the whole entire movie until the end, where she splits into 3 different translucent Madam Web ghost clones and then drops a Pepsi sign on the bad guy to save the day. Then she's blind, I guess, or something. Though to be fair, if you include CPR as action, there's at least 4 or 5 separate scenes of people performing CPR both on dummies and real people, though only the chest pumps, never any mouth to mouth, but I guess it still counts. And it's things like that that kind of raise the alarm bells that AI may have been used in the making of this script, because it takes these very literal, non-creative interpretations of Madam Web's character traits and spits out these bizarre action sequences that incorporate those things. Like, you tell an AI that Madam Web is a paramedic, and then it poops out the idea of Madam Web fighting the bad guy with an ambulance and doing a whole bunch of CPR because paramedic or something, or a scene where the teenage girls jump on a table in a diner and dance for some cute boys because I guess that's what teenage girls do or something, or the bad guy being introduced in an opera scene wearing a suit to show how evil he is and having him say lines like, "I pay you good money to do evil things for me, and if you don't do them, I will kill you because I am evil." I'm paraphrasing here, but that's not too far off. Also, the bad guy, who I will continue to call the bad guy because there is no other way to describe him or his motivation, and if not for that hilarious trailer line, I wouldn't even know his actual name, due to, I assume, mistakes made in the edit, seems to slip in and out of his suit and his like monkey Spider-Man costume various times in the same sequence without ever showing it. There will be a shot of him running at the heroes in his no-shoes suit outfit, and then it'll cut, and he'll be wearing his full one-piece villain outfit. Again, I assume it's a continuity error, but the edit kind of makes it feel intentional because it's not really trying to hide anything. I think they just don't know how to craft a sequence that makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't put it past an actual human to conceptualize and write and direct stuff this strange. If anything, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt by saying it was AI, because at least there's some excuse then, and surely an algorithm is the only thing that would write this movie's version of
"With great power comes great responsibility,"
which even in this sea of ever-expanding bizarre choices might take the cake as the dumbest thing in the entire movie. For whatever reason, ever since that line was dropped in Spider-Man back in 2002, Sony has felt the need to shove it in not 1, not 2, but now 3 subsequent times. One now in a movie that doesn't even feature Spider-Man. They do it in The Amazing Spider-Man 1, where it's more or less the same line but long-winded for some reason.
"You're a lot like your father. You really are. For other people, you had a moral obligation. He believed that if you could do..." But your father lived by a philosophy, a principle. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility.
They do it again in No Way Home, and to the credit of that movie, it just comes out and says the exact same line again, because who cares? That's the line.
"And with great power, there must also come great responsibility."
And now, in this movie, for some reason, they do the line again, but somehow even dumber than you could ever expect. So the normal line is this:
"With great power comes great responsibility."
Now that's good, but it's not great, okay? How do we fix this? Oh shit, something's happening. We have movement, people. Here it comes. Oh dear God.
Let's try that again.
Now, I was convinced this line was created via AI when it was first said because it just had to be, right? Surely no one can think of something this stupid, but it isn't just thrown in there once out of shame because they have to, like how it is in The Amazing Spider-Man 1. No. They say that line, I think, 3 times, which implies someone thought that was a really killer, awesome line that people would hear and be like, oh shit, that's the line, but different. I mean, it really makes you wonder how they assumed people would respond to the movie, not just in a positive or negative sense, but they throw all kinds of Spider-Man references into this movie like that line that I guess is supposed to be their attempts to get the crowd to lose their shit, like when Andrew and Toby appeared in No Way Home. But not only does it all fall completely flat, but it just makes the movie needlessly confusing. I mean, I haven't even gotten to the fact that half of this movie is centered around the Jesus-like birth of Peter Parker, despite the fact that it has absolutely nothing to do with the Madam Web story.
Intriguing.
They have Emma Roberts show up, of all people, and make her almost say the name Peter over and over again, but never actually say it. And I guess they did that because we in the crowd are supposed to turn to the person next to us and whisper, "That's Peter Parker, that's Spider-Man." And not that anybody wouldn't pick up on the not so subtle hint that the baby is Peter Parker, but if you had no prior knowledge of Spider-Man or didn't realize there was a connection between that character and Madam Web, you would just be beyond confused that the movie is devoting so much time to this random woman's pregnancy and birth that, again, does not impact the plot in any way. It's an issue that a lot of these cinematic universe films have, where they spend too much time setting up future products that end up taking away from the product you're trying to sell right now. But Madam Web takes it to such a cynical, borderline satirical maximum where it's literally just thrown in there, and neither the writers nor the director made even the slightest attempt to weave it into the main story. And it's also set up for future installments that are never going to happen, which makes it all the more insane. Like, I realize that it's almost certainly a studio mandated thing, and the current studio system, especially in regards to these kinds of movies, is a nightmare, but plenty of other writers and directors are able to pull it off in a way that at the very least makes sense in the context of the movie. It can be done, and certainly can be done with a better effort than this pile of shit. But hey, that's also what makes this movie so special. If they tried harder, it wouldn't even be worth seeing, ironically. Hey, anybody got a Pepsi?
Grab a Pepsi Wild Cherry and get wild.
So everyone is talking about how this movie is basically an advertisement for Pepsi, and I don't disagree, but I will say I do have a different favorite Pepsi scene than most people do. You see, most people are giving all the love to the ending where they fight on the giant Pepsi sign and the bad guy gets smushed by the giant Pepsi sign, and that's great, don't get me wrong, but my favorite Pepsi scene is not that Pepsi scene, but a different Pepsi scene, the one that happens during the baby shower scene. You see, in that Pepsi scene, all the gals are around a table doing those baby shower games, and it's like a 3-camera setup, right? So you get nearly a full 360-degree view of the room. Not quite, but about close to it. And right in center frame on the coffee table lies one beautiful can of Pepsi. Only one though, and despite the fact that in the flow of the edit, not a one person touches that can of Pepsi, it somehow manages to perfectly rotate every single cut to where that gorgeous logo is right in center frame. Simply put, it's brilliant. You see, in most movies that advertise things like soda, they just set up a shot like this one where it's one camera and there's no cuts and the Coke can just sit still and not have to get moved to be shown. In other words, lazy filmmaking. But Madam Web makes the bold choice to subtly establish some ethereal presence that rotates the can of Pepsi without anyone noticing. It's some pretty surreal experimental filmmaking, and I for one didn't even notice it was meant as an ad. I'll tell you what though, I could sure go for a can of Pepsi.
Grab a Pepsi Wild Cherry and get wild.
All this leads me to believe one of two things. One, Sony is somehow convinced that any of their current or future plans are going to work despite all evidence to the contrary, meaning they have completely lost the plot. Or two, they are intentionally speeding up the death of the comic book film as a viable blockbuster. And not just speeding it up, we're talking a full-blown speed run here, okay? 2 more of these nightmares coming out this year could tank consumer faith in the genre to a point where it could actually bleed into other studios like WB and Disney. And perhaps that's been the goal all along. Sony, despite having the most popular Marvel Comics character, was somehow incapable of building a cinematic universe, and by the time they realized the amount of money they missed out on, it was already long out of reach. And now, they aren't just taking their toys and going home. No, they're burning the whole house down on their way out. Whatever the case, after seeing Madam Web, my hype for Kraven in Venom 3 has only gotten higher because this is a studio that dares to lower the bar where no one else will. Not sure if anyone's going to pick that bar back up at some point, but for now, I'm just gonna sit back and enjoy the dumpster fire because honestly, as bad as all this is, it's certainly something special and something we probably won't see ever again.